Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today is the 11th of November 2020. So what we decided to do is dedicate our video today to the unknown warrior, and the actual interment, or shall we say the lying in state of the unknown warrior, took place exactly 100 years ago. And the story is actually very interesting because when you think about it, there was a huge number of people that couldn't grieve because they were known as missing in action, people that had vanished, or soldiers that were never fully identified. And the interesting thing is, someone came up with a great idea to find an unknown soldier, an unknown warrior, and bring them back for very much a state funeral back in Britain. And that really started the ball rolling. And we know on the 7th of November 1920, what they decided to do is dig and find 4 unknown soldiers with no form of identification. So no dog tags, no bracelets with names on, no documentation, no photographs or anything like that. So literally 4 unknown soldiers, and they were found. And the interesting thing is, I always find, is the fact that the soldiers who were told to dig up these bodies of these unknown soldiers, these unknown warriors, were not really told what they were doing. All they were told was to dig and bag and really give it a lot of respect, the bringing home of an unknown soldier. And this photograph here was taken on the 7th of November, and it actually shows the very careful digging up, and also the very careful covering of the body using a Union flag, as you can see. And the Union flag actually follows the unknown warrior all the way from France, technically. So they chose 4 unknown soldiers, unknown warriors, and they took them to the GHQ, the General Headquarters of the British forces, in what is technically a battle-scarred landscape in 1920. And there they had to choose one of them. So they find 4 people and they decide to choose one of them. They do confirm that they're unknown soldiers. They also confirm that they're actually British soldiers and not, for example, American or anything like that. And when the decision was made, it's interesting that Brigadier General Wyatt chose the one body, and that was placed inside a coffin. And the coffin is actually very interesting. Now, we've got here the plans, not the original obviously, but the plans of the coffin that the unknown warrior would lie in. And it's made out of English oak, and that came from Hampton Court, with all hand forged ironwork around it. And there's also a nice breastplate on the front there, a chest plate, not quite a piece of armour, but a breastplate for the coffin. And you will also notice there is a sword, a crusading sword, as they said, really. And that one individual, like I said, was chosen out of that 4. The other 3 went back for burial as unknown soldiers as well, but that one specifically would be taken back to Britain. Now, this is a photograph on the 9th of November 1920 of the unknown warrior being taken by an escort of French soldiers to the coast, to Boulogne, basically. And from there was a ship waiting. That ship was known as HMS Verdun, and on the 9th, that ship set sail from Boulogne to Dover. And it crossed the sea, and it was given great respect all the way across. There was flowers, there's obviously an honour guard, as you can see there. And then it arrived at Dover, and on Dover, or on the quayside at Dover, on the 10th of November 1920, there was a 19-gun salute. And the train was then taken, or the unknown warrior was then taken on a train journey to London, Victoria. The interesting thing about the train is the unknown warrior actually travelled in a van, as such, if you want to use technical terms, a van, which is actually still around. And we were fortunate enough to work with it when it came to the Severn Valley Railway as part of the centenary, when it travelled around a vast number of steam railways or heritage railways, for example. and it's been completely restored now. I'll show you a photograph that we took whilst we were using it, and as you can see, that's the interior of the van, and you will notice there is an exact replica of the coffin that was used for the Unknown Warrior. So they've really done a magnificent amount of work in that van to restore it, especially when you see the photographs of it before it was restored. So a huge amount of effort and work went into restoring that van. And if you do get a chance, do visit it, because I think it's still travelling around the countryside that is really worth looking at. It's an interesting van because it had been used for transporting or repatriating the body of Edith Cavell, the nurse that was executed by the Germans for the main reason of helping British prisoners of war escape. So she was executed and she was repatriated with that van, that railway carriage. And then also something that's very rarely mentioned is Charles Fryatt, who was a member of the Merchant Navy, not necessarily the Royal Navy as far as I'm aware, and he was actually executed for ramming a U-boat with his ship, and he was executed by the Germans, and they repatriated his body. So the actual carriage, even though it's often referred to as the carriage of the Unknown Warrior, it's usually also known as the Edith Cavell carriage, or even Charles Fryatt carriage. If you do get a chance to visit it, there is an exhibition about these three people that were actually transported in that van, in that carriage. It's really worth having a look at. But then when we get to the 11th of November, bear in mind the carriage sat at Victoria Station. The coffin was then placed onto a gun carriage to give it a state funeral, and the carriage was actually dragged by 6 black stallions, 6 black horses, and it travelled through the streets of London, very much the same respect as it had when it travelled through France, from GHQ to the coast and then across. And it passed the War Memorial, the cenotaph, I should call it really. And the cenotaph's got an interesting story as well. As I mentioned in the previous video, cenotaph actually means empty tomb. And it was quite relevant really for the Great War especially, but any wars ever since, of people that are missing or people that lie in graves abroad. We've got a place where we can visit, a tomb which is empty. And that's the reason why we use the word cenotaph. It actually comes from an ancient Greek word, in fact. And the cenotaph was actually built originally in 1919 for Peace Day in the summer, in July 1919. It was only meant to be a temporary structure, so we know it was actually made out of timber and also plaster. And that sat in Whitehall in pretty much the same place as the present cenotaph. And because of the demand, because people thought it was such a good idea, they decided to make a permanent structure of it by the time we have the Unknown Warrior in 1920. So it's got an interesting story in its own right. The actual wooden topper of the original timber and plaster one is actually, or was used, and sits in the Imperial War Museum, and I believe that was the focal point for their remembrance services. I'm not sure if it's still out on display. I'm sure it is. I haven't been to the Imperial War Museum for a long time, but this is a cenotaph, and I'm sure most people have actually seen it and probably even passed by it over the years really. So that is what it looks like, and it had 2 very, very large Union flags on it, and a very clever system whereby the king pressed a button and the flags dropped from it. If you ever watch the footage, and you'll be able to see that on Pathé News, for example, or any of the old footage websites out there, there was an incident as part of that unveiling where the Union flag didn't come fully off on the one bit, and there's this 1 or 2 people pulling it and tugging it to pull it down. But the actual cenotaph, like I said, was originally a timber and plaster structure, and this is the plan for it really. Once again, not the original, but Edwin Lutyens was the man that designed it, and he did an absolutely fantastic job of creating something to be the empty tomb. And like I said, the carriage and the unknown warrior passed by this, stopped. Famously, the king actually saluted it and placed some flowers on top of the coffin. They unveiled the cenotaph, and then the coffin, or the unknown warrior, continued its journey into Westminster Abbey. The route was lined by Victoria Cross winners. They became an honour guard for it, and 100 widows got the invite to actually attend the so-called funeral lying in state ceremony. Famously at the time, it was said that any widow that wanted to come was entitled. And in total, there was 100 widows, it was said, just over 100 widows that were there to greet the unknown warrior. And the sad thing I always think about that is, if there is anyone watching and your ancestors were technically missing in action, for example, or became one of the graves of the unknown soldier, you will never really know. So it's quite a poignant thing, I think. If you had a relation that was missing in action, it could very easily be your relation that is the unknown warrior in London. I think that's a really poignant thing. The body laid in state, as you can see. It was covered in flowers and that as well originally. And for the days that followed, interestingly, there were it's something about just over a million, 1.2 million visitors actually came to the tomb of the unknown warrior. And then finally, the unknown warrior was buried within Westminster Abbey, and famously buried within the same church is many monarchs, basically buried between kings, and that's quite a dramatic statement, if you ask me. There is the grave or the interment, shall we say, really, of the unknown warrior when it was first put into the ground, and as you can see, covered in flowers and also with the Union flag. And like I said, that Union flag was draped over the coffin, as any military funeral would have, all the way from the battlefields, basically across the sea into London, into Dover in London, and then into Westminster Abbey. It's an interesting thing because, as I mentioned, the coffin is made from oak at Hampton Court, and on board the van, the carriage that brought the unknown warrior, were actually 16 barrels of soil, and that was soil taken from the battlefield. And the interesting thing is, when they lowered the coffin into its tomb, they surrounded it and covered it with soil from the battlefield. So there's a lot of poignancy, there's a lot of important gestures that went on with the burial. It wasn't just a burial, they put a lot of thought into it. The other interesting things is the marble capping stone that sits on top of it, that you still see today, was in fact made of Belgian marble. So once again, linking to the battlefields in Europe. But remember, this was a global conflict, involved many countries. Worcestershire Yeomanry, for example, fought in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, and places like that. And then the other interesting thing is the lettering on the actual stone is made from melted brass from the battlefield. So the things that your bullet casings come in, the shell casings, for example. So there's a lot of symbolism, shall we say, for the unknown warrior. And then from that date onwards, so 100 years ago, really, after the laying in the state and eventual burial of the unknown warrior, even today, it is given pride of place inside Westminster Abbey. And the famous thing, and this is the most important thing, I think, is it's the only tomb, it's the only plaque that you are not allowed to walk over, full stop. So if you go into Worcester Cathedral, for example, you will find on the floor several tombs, several plaque markers, that sort of thing. People walk over them all the time, and you'll find that in any church, any cathedral, really. But as you can see, this one has poppies around it permanently, and that is really to stop people walking on it. It's the only tombstone, the only tomb that you are definitely not allowed to walk over. So just to recap, 100 years ago today, the tomb, or shall we say the unknown warrior, was taken on a gun carriage through London, watched the unveiling basically, or was there at the unveiling of the cenotaph, this new stone cenotaph, not the old timber and plaster one, and then taken to Westminster Abbey. And it was a sign, a symbol of the grief of all the people that had been killed during the war, and specifically those without a marked grave. And as I mentioned before, if you do have relations that were missing in action during the Great War, especially in the theatre of France, in the area of the Somme, for example, in Ypres, that could very easily be your ancestor. That could be your ancestor in the middle of a church amongst kings, and I think that's a very special thing. So hopefully you've learnt a little bit more about the unknown warrior. If you get a chance, have a look online at the video of the or the footage of the unknown warrior going through London. It is very poignant, really worth looking at, especially on Armistice Day, on the day when the unknown warrior came back and was eventually laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. Anyway, on that note, please subscribe to our videos, and remember, let us know what you would like to see. We will keep on inventing topics, but if you've got anything that you want us to talk about specifically, please let us know. Look out for some craft activities, look out for some cooking, and also look out for some local history. These are the key things that everyone seems to like. Anyway, on that note, stay safe and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.